ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
In some remote forests in southwest Tasmania, there are individual trees that have stood there for thousands of years, since the time of ancient Babylon, and some that are older still. Tasmania is world renowned for its trees that are impossibly ancient and which grow nowhere else on the globe. There are some whose ancestors grew up alongside dinosaurs, and so many of them are massively huge and tall. The places where these trees grow are often inaccessible to human beings. They're surrounded by dense vegetation. The weather is fierce, and they're often a long way from a nice, warm, comfortable bed. But this hasn't stopped Andrew Darby trekking out to meet them, even though Andrew's in his 70s now and didn't have much bushwalking experience. But finding these ancient giants who have survived and grown so huge over the millennia was thrilling and magical. Andrew Darby is an author of several wonderful books on the natural world. His latest book is called The Ancients, Discovering the World's Oldest Surviving Trees in Wild Tasmania. Welcome back, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Richard. Wonderful to be here.
There were two things you say that drew you to these trees in these deeply forested parts of Tasmania. The first you say is the phenomenon of the dry thunderstorm. Can you describe what that's like and how it works?
Okay, so in Tasmania there's always been thunderstorms. They run across, there's lightning and thunder and lots of rain. In Tasmania there's a new phenomenon for us of dry lightning thunderstorms. Most recently, there was one that went through in February and then another one in early March, two dry thunderstorms that lit up drying wild country in Tasmania. You get multiple strikes, multiple fires, and they are proving beyond our capacity to fight.
So the lightning hits the dry vegetation on the ground, creates a fire, but there's no rain to douse it.
Exactly right. And sometimes what will happen too is that the lightning will hit a dead tree or something like that, and it'll sit there, won't burn immediately. You won't get a fire immediately. When the spotter aircraft go through after a dry lightning thunderstorm, they won't pick it up. And then days or even a week later, the embers will catch in a breeze, it'll drop, and you'll get a new fire starting up. It's something that firefighters have to evolve really quickly to learn about.
And you say this is a relatively new phenomenon in Tasmania.
It is, yes. There have always been thunderstorms, but not these dry lightning thunderstorms. This is a phenomenon of climate change that's come about probably in about the last 20 years, in which there have been these episodic fires. They're a huge challenge now, each February, March particularly.
And these can strike in wilderness areas. So what kind of surveillance can be done in these cases to try and nip these fires in the bud? And can that even be done?
Yes, it can. That is the particular challenge for Tasmania. In a lot of these places where the fires start, there's no roads. You can't send a fire crew in on a road to douse it quickly. You need aerial surveillance. What it often starts with is satellite surveillance of where the lightning strikes are most frequent, meteorological information to go along with that about rainfall or not. And then there's follow-ups by spotter aircraft who, when the thunderstorm is cleared away as soon as possible, they get out in the daylight usually and try to search out for the smoke and the fires. There's new tools too. It's a really interesting new tool, a remote 360-degree camera that is AI trained to spot smoke and then satellite linked to the firefighter who has an app on his phone. He gets told by the camera that there is smoke rising in a particular spot. These sorts of tools are going to be really vital in fighting climate change fire.
There are a lot of lakes around that part of the world. Is that a big help when it comes to trying to get a helicopter in with a big bucket to douse these fires?
The listeners would know of Lake St Clair. It's the bottom end of the overland track. It's often visited. It's a beautiful highland lake surrounded by tall mountains. But it's quite a long lake. And when there was a recent dry lightning fire on the overland track north of Lake St Clair, there was a little swarm of Fireboss skimmer aircraft, scoop and drop. They come down on their floats, skim up a load of water, and then take it up to the fire to drop. And they were doing circuits day after day after day on the overland track fire. They nearly caught it. They didn't quite catch it. It got away because of a weather change. But those are the sorts of tools that are going to be really important too. We're really getting used to the sound of Fireboss aircraft going out over us. They have a high turbo whine, and there's a little fleet of them that you see heading out, and you say, okay, yep, there's another fire.
So that's the first thing that got you thinking about the survival of the ancient trees.
Yeah.
The second thing is something we talked about last time you were here when we were talking about your book Flightlines, which is you being a cancer survivor. You had stage 4 lung cancer. Now, that's normally a death sentence, and you are sitting across from me alive and well. How has this happened?
Human ingenuity, medical science, that's what got me where I am today. Immunotherapy has saved me without any question, and it is doing the same for many other cancer patients, and I hope increasingly many more. This and other cancer treatments just are developing in leaps and bounds. They're wonderful things. And so, yes, I am a survivor. And when you are given a second chance at life, you think to yourself, what am I going to be doing with this? Each person individually would decide, I need to spend more time with the grandkids. I need to visit that far-off place that I haven't been to. I need to buy a Maserati. I resisted the Maserati temptation.
Doesn't get you too far into the bush, does it, the Maserati?
And I thought to myself, I kind of owe it to make some use of this. And so I returned to a lost youth of bushwalking and the frustration of being a deadline-driven daily news journalist who can only get to touch these things briefly, and decided to get out and find these trees and look at these trees and be among them and realize the splendor of them. They have extraordinary lives. They exist in a special island, and we really can learn huge lessons from them about how to live our lives too.
You said your encounters with these trees had been so brief as a journalist when you were the Tasmanian correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and for The Age. So you could glimpse these things, but you had to run in, get the story and go back out again to file it? Was that how it was?
That's how it worked. It was always something of a frustration. From the time of the very early 1980s forest protests down at Farmhouse Creek right through to the end of my time with the newspapers, there have been forest stories to write about. And they tended to be about the native forest wars in one form or another, about the struggle over eucalypts more than anything. And the paleo-endemics, as they're called, the ancient only in Tasmania trees.
Paleo-endemic, so that means something that's ancient and something only to be found in Tasmania.
In one particular place, in Tasmania.
And does this make Tasmania a kind of a mecca for tree scientists, for botanists?
There are a few of them around the world. The ones that I would nominate would be Chile, parts of California, and Tasmania. They're the treasure houses,
Why is Tasmania so special for trees?
Well, it goes back to our Gondwanan history, our links in the ancient supercontinent, and the separation of Tasmania from Australia, its separation from the Gondwanan supercontinent, and the flora that was carried with it on that separation.
So now that you'd recovered and declared cancer-free, you're ready to go out into the wild, but you'd done all that reporting, as I said, on the conservation wars and been out into the wilderness. But how much bushwalking experience did you have?
Relatively little. I'm sort of moderately fit, And I found out how moderately fit I was when I began bushwalking seriously again. But I decided to try and do something about that.
How did you prepare yourself?
Well, it was an inch-by-inch thing. You know, you buy the fancy Scandinavian hiking pants, but they don't actually really help you get very far. You gear yourself up as best you can with safety equipment and all that sort of thing. You do your day walks. You do your tentative overnight walk. You take up Pilates, you do the sorts of things that might get you a little bit further than you thought you might as you started off. And then, gradually you get out walking. I found that I was amongst the slowest walkers on the track, in any given track.
Is there anything wrong with that?
I don't really think there's too much wrong with that. I kind of envy those lithe young things that, they're in trail running gear and they're not carrying a visible emergency pack or anything like that, but they have the confidence of youth and they just lope along past you. But eventually you catch up to them at the destination and they're taking selfies with a phone of the same thing that you've come to see, the same special trees that you've come to see, and then they disappear and you slowly trek back.
So this book was 3 years of solo bushwalking in the making. Why solo? Why did you want to go solo?
I found myself really wanting the company of my wife Sally by the end of it. I really wanted to share these things with her. But I felt that I needed to go solo bushwalking because I wanted to engage with the trees as much as I could, to be in their company rather than human company, and to be able to feel what they had to offer, how they responded to the wind, or how they felt to touch what was around them in terms of bird or animal life and all of those sorts of things. Those sorts of things, they're great to share with another, but if you're trying on a specific direction to write about these species and their special nature, then I felt that I really should do it alone. I should say, and as a caution, that I had 2 emergency locator beacons on me at all times, and anybody who's walking in the Tasmanian bush alone needs to take great precautions.
You don't want to be one of those national news stories. A search for lost bushwalker Andrew Darby goes into its 8th day today. Family is still clinging to hope, that kind of thing. That wasn't you in the end, was it?
No, that wasn't me in the end. I was very risk averse. Yes, here I am. Yeah.
I suppose when I talk about this with you, I imagine that the project initially is about going out and seeing these trees, but when you're in the wilderness, in your tent at night, I imagine it becomes more about listening to them and smelling them and all the other senses that open up when you're lying in the total and absolute darkness of the wilderness at night.
Yeah, well, that's so right. There is the dark and the feel of the wind through the trees. I walked to Lake Petrarch at the foot of a mountain called Mount Olympus. This lake was something that I really wanted to reach because George Franklin, an early colonial surveyor, found these pencil pines here, these glorious pencil pines, which he called Pine of Olympus. And to me, if I have a favourite child in all of these trees that I've looked at, it is pencil pine. It is so varied in its beauty. So there I am, camped for the night, and I've enjoyed the beauty of the sundown on the pencil pine, and I'm settling down in my tent, and suddenly a wind whistles up. And this is no ordinary wind. It's a gale over the kilometre-long fetch of the lake, and I'm on the lake shore. Fortunately, I have pitched the tent so that the lower end and my feet are pointing at the gale, and I'm lying there holding the centre pole for the night while I listen to the gale come and go, the gusts building, the lake shore, the waves crashing, the screeching of eucalyptus leaves, and this sort of hooling of the wind through the pencil pine. It wasn't a howling, it was a hooling. It was, the pencil pine just seemed more capable of bearing the night. So I made it through the night. Dawn comes, there's a thunder crash. I get up, the rain comes, and then I'm on my way out again, sort of spanked by wild Tasmania. Yes.
Spanked by the wilderness.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I was.
One of the most important trees you wanted to see was a tree called the King's Lomatia. This is one of the most ancient plants on the planet. Before we get into the tree itself, tell me about the man it was named for.
Denny King, the King family, and particularly Denny King, were legendary figures in southwest Tasmania. His father, Charlie King, went there to mine tin in the early 20th century. Denny followed and married and raised a family at Melaleuca in southwest Tasmania. And Denny, being a tin miner too, he and his father had always had an appreciation of nature. He was brought up with an appreciation of nature. And being a miner, he had an eye for the ground. You look at the ground, if you're a miner, and you know what's worth looking at. On their Sundays off, they would go out around in the mountains and valleys and shorelines, and they would collect. They were botanical collectors. Botanical collectors are often not scientifically skilled, but they know when something's different, and they gradually build up an understanding of plants. They're amazing people. They tend to be very hardy bushwalkers too.
So he's living in a mining hut in the wilderness, and he's going around collecting specimens from the 1930s to the 1960s, 1970s,
yes,
thereabouts,
yes.
This trove of material. How did he encounter this plant, the King's Lomatia? What caught his eye?
Well, he had been looking for it for a long time, and the reason he had been looking for it is that it was found by him or his father about 30 years previously and taken to the herbarium in Hobart, where nobody could really identify it. They kept the specimen, they couldn't identify it. And so when they went back to a range where it was, the New Harbour Range, it wasn't there anymore. Fire had been through. And Denny, in his searching, just came upon it again in the early 1960s. And being the bushman it was, he was pushing into fairly inaccessible country and managed to find the specimen of a holly-like plant. It's a bit like, it has a sort of blood-red flower, which is a bit like a grevilleous flower.
What, a leaf with points on it?
Like a leaf with points on it like a holly.
But it's not a holly, is it?
No, it's not a holly. It's nowhere near a holly. It's a Lomatia. Lomatias are distinctively Australian. Also, there's a Lomatia in South America.
Which points to how ancient they are, doesn't it? So this comes from a time when South America and Australia were connected.
Yes, yeah.
So what did he do with the specimen once he found it?
He collected for a woman he called Curtie. I'm collecting this for Curtie. And Curtie was the very redoubtable Dr. Winifred Curtis. She was a very singular botanist who, over the course of 50 years, published 7 volumes of something called The Student's Flora of Tasmania. She was a serious writer of botany. So Denny collected for Curtie. The specimens went out on a plane that comes into the rough airstrip that Denny dug with the bulldozer. And she, through consultation, identified it as a Lomatia, but also as an entirely new species. And she called it Lomatia tasmanica, that's its Latin name, now known as King's Lomatia.
How was the age of this species established?
Well, that was down to Denny too, in a way. So it's alive in one particular place, and that is some distance away from Melaleuca, where he was mining. But when he was mining, part of a layer of sediment that he dug away looked really different and interesting to him. It turned out to be a sort of a lens, that is, a layer of sediment that is laid down and then materials laid over the top of it. And because materials laid over the top of it, it gets preserved. It's anaerobic and it gets preserved. So there are fossils in there. So he set this aside, and towards the end of his mining career, he remembered that material, and he sent a few samples to University of Tasmania, where there was a PhD student, Greg Jordan, working on plant extinctions. And Greg had a look at this, thought the sediment looked really interesting, and went down to Melaleuca, went through it with Denny, collected bits and pieces of it, took it back to his laboratory, and there Greg found a leaf of King's Lomatia. That fossil was established through a couple of carbon dating sequences to be 43,000 years old. You say to yourself, okay, well, that's fine. King's Lomatia's been around for that long. But what makes it particularly special is that it is only that single plant of King's Lomatia that has been around for that long.
Okay, now you better explain what that means.
So, genetic work that was subsequently done on King's Lomatia established that it is what is known as a triploid clone. The banana plant is a triploid clone.
What does that mean, though?
It can't reproduce itself. It can't set seed. That flower, that blood red flower on King's Lomatia, never turns to seed. It just can't do it.
How does it regenerate then?
By root running and then stems rising. So this King's Lomatia has been reproducing itself quietly in a corner of southwest Tasmania by root running and stems rising for obviously beyond 43,000 years.
Are you saying that all these trees are the one tree?
That's right.
Going back 43,000 years.
The extent of the single plant is fragmented and extends over an area of there's one patch, the stems are close together, another patch where they're scattered, and they're about 1 kilometre apart, those two patches. And
okay, so they're separated,
yeah.
But they are of the same plant, the same as that plant fossil that was 43,000 years old?
Exactly.
And bananas are the same? Like, have we been eating the one banana all this time?
I think we have.
Well, from the one banana tree. That kind of blows my mind. But if it can't seed, that means it can't evolve then, really? Is that right? Because you can't get the genetic diversity then.
That's right.
So the King's Lomatia has to stay the same. And at the same token, the banana does as well. But, the banana is a domesticated thing, isn't it? It's like, they're like cats and dogs. They're these things that have thrown their lot in with humans, and we like them to stay the way they are because we use the food that they provide all the time. But what about the King's Lomatia? How has it survived 43,000 years at least without changing?
Yeah. This is its danger, that it is just surviving, that it may be approaching the end of its life as a species. It was found, up at Melaleuca, originally in another range. The obvious thinking is that it extended. It was quite happy where it was extending in that manner over area of, some square kilometres, many square kilometres perhaps.
Where humans can't get to it.
Where humans didn't get to it. And particularly where Europeans didn't get to it. Tasmania has, and particularly the southwest, has a World Heritage recognised cultural landscape of button grass plains, which are burnt and have been burnt by Aboriginal people for tens of thousands of years. But they burnt light. Always burnt light. The cultural tradition was to burn light, and so things like that survived. But what happened for King's Lomatia is that late 19th century, early 20th century miners came to the area looking for tin, and they just burnt the ground. They just burnt the ground because it was just in their way. So they just burnt the flora. And so it would seem to me that King's Lomatia stands suffered badly as a result of that.
Nonetheless, this tree has been around that long. Where does that place it in the oldest living plant on the planet stakes?
It gets into the Guinness Book of Records to that extent. The science is developing on these things. There's a quaking aspen in the United States that is being aged at least 16,000 and potentially much more than that. But you have to sort of say to yourself, well, 43,000 is a nominal figure. What you really need to feel about this extraordinary tree is that it's clung to life in its own way for at least that long, for a very, very long period of time. And the duty we have to protect this sort of thing, if we are to realise our place on Earth, is huge. It's just huge.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Feidler.
Before you were talking about going out to see the King Billy pine, where you woke up after a strange night, exhausted in your tent, and you said you felt like you were surrounded by dinosaurs. What do you mean?
170 million years old. The King Billy pine species and its sister, the pencil pine. They are unchanged as trees from that time. What an extraordinary idea that is. I was walking to a place called Lake Sydney, and that was in search of very old King Billy pines. It's sort of a King Billy pine stronghold. I found it very, very difficult. The track was very hard.
When you say hard, what do you mean?
I mean, it was hard to find through the thick bush. The past bushwalkers had set up little tape lines, but these were really old tape lines. They're tiny little fragments of pink tape. I called it the pink tape of comfort because each bit of pink tape I was very glad to see. And things like horizontal scrub, like Hawaii Bowera, which builds a sort of impenetrable wall sometimes that you actually have to throw yourself at to get through.
What, you have to run back and then run into it, you mean?
Probably not face on, side on sort of thing. So
you don't have a machete, in other words?
No, no machete was used in this book.
Okay.
and so, yeah, by the time I got to near Lake Sydney and decided that this was enough for the night, I set up and I just collapsed on the track and badly pitched the tent and crawled into it and went to sleep, and then woke up next morning to the glory of King Billy pine at dawn, straight out of the Jurassic. A wonderful, wonderful thing to see, a huge reward for making that effort. So I had a look at some of the potential for dinosaurs to have been around at that time, and I spoke to Victorian paleontologist Thomas Rich, who explained to me that indeed there may have been a reptilian head poking around a tree from a very, very substantially large biped.
Perhaps cocking its leg and offering nutrients to the King Billy pine way back when?
Perhaps doing so, yes, perhaps doing so. But you do feel that also in the form of the tree. So you have to imagine that 170 million years ago, with Gondwana where it was...
This is the supercontinent.
The supercontinent. Tasmania was much closer to the pole. So inevitably, that meant that there were 24-hour daylight in summer and total darkness in winter for periods, that because the continent was so much closer to the pole. And so what the King Billy pine does, and other paleoendemics like it do, is they raise their branches up to meet the sun, to maximise the exposure of the sun to their leaves. And I could see that. I was lying there outside the tent. I could see that on this beautiful dawn, this verdant dawn. I'm lying on moss. There's a beautiful little climbing flower called Prionotes, little red flower twined around the King Billy trunk, which is mossed over totally. There's a buttress of moss on the King Billy pine. There was bird calls. There's always currawongs. There were things like the Tasmanian yellow-throated honeyeater, which has a lovely trill. it was very, very ancient being there.
What does this kingbilly pine look like then? You mentioned it has branches that sort of reach up to grab as much sun as it can get. What does it look like?
So when I wrap my arms around a trunk, the trunk is soft and yielding. The branches, it rises up in a fairly straight single stem often. Sometimes that'll be broken and another two stems will rise, but there was one there that was more like a candelabra where the stem had been broken and there were perhaps half a dozen or 8 stems rising up to the sun. The ground around it, apart from the moss, is often covered with these brown fingers of the leaves that have fallen from the kingbilly pine, and that's the first indication I had when going through a kingbilly pine forest, because I have my head down most of the time, was the brown fingers on the ground, this carpet of brown fingers. So that's another feature of the kingbilly. The leaves themselves are actually, you don't want to run your hand down the wrong way. They're quite sharp, but they just bespeak oldness.
Your theory is that there's lots of different theories about how the kingbilly pine gets its name, but your theory is that they were named after Mount King William in Tasmania. Tell me what you see when you approach the foot of Mount King William, where there was the rainforest holding these trees.
So the Cross Island Highway, the Lyell Highway, passes through Derwent Bridge, and then you get into this lovely open button grass plain, the Navarre Plains, and then just before you head down into the true West Coast country, there's a patch of rainforest near the foot of Mount King William. Most people just don't see it, but there are just 4 or 5 really old kingbilly pines in this patch of rainforest right beside the highway. They are so old, probably approaching 1,000 years old. They are so old that they haven't been burnt out. They're actually sort of dying of age, but there's leafy clumps still at the top of them. To me, they're like steeples above a village. Despite their commonplace location beside the highway, to me, I felt a reverence about them. They were something that was watching over the forest almost.
When you step into that rainforest, is it one of those very dark places you can go into because of the canopy overhead? Was it like that in this rainforest?
It's like a sliding door. You park the car, step off the highway, over a ditch, and open the Myrtle Beach canopy beneath the kingbillies, step in. You're on mossy ground. There are branches scattered around. Movement's quite easy once you've stepped through the curtain, as it were. And every sound is sort of held and distinct. I could hear my breathing, and that's not because I was exerting myself. I just walked out of the car.
It's quiet then. It's not full of chittering animals then.
No, it's quiet. You'll get the occasional... There's a Tasmanian scrub wren, and it has a very insistent, bossy little twit. I think there might have been a yellow-throat honeyeater there too. But it is a very quiet place. It's lovely and quiet.
These were trees that were harvested for timber, weren't they? Like Huon pine.
They were. Kingbilly was later to be discovered as a timber tree. Huon was always the one that was easy to access. You could get it in the early days because people travelled by water, not by land. And it was a very compliant tree. It floated. You could gather it when it was downstream.
Smelled great too.
Smelled great. It's a beautiful wood. Kingbilly was not so well regarded. It suffered burning by miners on the west coast a lot too. The kingbilly population probably was reduced by about 50% during the 19th, early 20th century.
What's their status now?
They're protected. There are stands of fire-killed trees that are quite extensive, but there are also stands of healthy kingbilly pine.
You say your favourite of all these trees you came to love was the pencil pine. Now, the pencil pine, I'm thinking of like that pine I used to have in my front yard as a kind of a hedge fence. This is not the same thing, obviously. This is an indigenous tree. What is this pencil pine and what does it look like?
So the name Arthrotaxis coprosoides, it came about because Europeans decided that it looked like a European cypress in the forms that they saw it first. And it can stand, like a European cypress in some respects, but That's pretty rare. It has a huge variety of forms that depend on where it is located, what winds are coming at it, what water is around it, how it's protected from fire, how it's survived that. Some of the best pencil pine stands now are in boulder fields that don't burn. And so, yeah, it's the variety of forms that I really find absolutely intriguing about pencil pine.
Does it grow between the boulders or on the boulders?
I was walking along the track, Tarn Shelf, early on the track, and then I just spotted this little clump of pencil pine-like leaves that were emerging from above two rocks, and it was as if I was drawn hypnotically to it. I boulder hopped over to that spot and found this pencil pine that had planted itself and was growing in between huge boulders in a very exposed site to the wind and to the snow and the ice that blows around Mount Field. It just had this little head of live foliage above the rock. It had a couple of smaller branches that were already dead, and this stem sort of snaked down into some obscure spot where the trunk began. And I thought to myself, well, this is really, it's like penjing. Penjing is the predecessor of bonsai. Penjing is a Chinese art form of seeing the great from the small. So they do those things that probably people are more familiar with bonsai is they twist the trunks, they strip the bark, they place it in a miniature landscape of rock and so on.
But nature is the twister of the tree here.
Supremely in Tasmania, it does that.
You went out to look for one specific pencil pine, and this was the subject of a famous photo, a really beautiful photo. It was called Pencil Pine at the Pool of Siloam. Looks extraordinary. I'm just looking at that image now, and it's a pencil pine on the edge of a pool of water, and it's twisted in such a way it almost looks human, with one of the branches like an arm reaching down to touch the surface of the water. There's something strangely humanoid about this tree in this strange and primordial and heavenly landscape. How did you find this tree in the end?
What an extraordinary tree and what an extraordinary image. The Pool of Siloam is in the walls of Jerusalem National Park.
See, this is what the names are of these places. The Walls of Jerusalem National Park, Mount Olympus. There are Old Testament names for these places. There's a Jericho, there's a Baghdad in the middle of Tasmania.
A lot of that to do with the Romantic era, I think, and the translation of that. The Pool of Siloam was where Jesus performed a miracle of making a blind man see. And so it was fitting that this is such a sight for sore eyes to have lively, healthy pencil pine. But this particular one, Peter Dombrovskis, the great nature photographer of Tasmania, took the photograph with his Linhof large format camera, a very heavy, technical, unwieldy beast. I can imagine him setting the camera up on a tripod. It even has a lens hood, the old-fashioned lens hood that you stick your head under to take the shot. There's a bit of frost and snow on the ground. There's fog on the Pool of Siloam behind him. And then there is this gorgeous single tree that is so evocative of struggle against the elements and survival. I ran into someone recently who said, oh yes, we call it the lady tree. They see it as a female form.
Like bent down to scoop the water or something.
Yes, something like that, yes. And he took this single shot, I can imagine him stamping his feet in the cold and waiting for the moment, because he did wait for the moment, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, and then taking the single shot of the pencil pine at Pool of Siloam.
That was shot decades ago.
Decades ago. And I thought to myself, how on earth am I going to find this tree? And so I walked up to the Pool of Siloam on the little track that goes up to it, and there it was, straight in front of me, instantly recognisable. And there had been a lot of pilgrims there before me. There was a log set up so people could sit and consider what they were looking at. There'd been quite a few footfalls, but the tree was untouched. The reverence was intact.
How happy did it make you to see this tree?
Well, it is elating, isn't it, to be able to accomplish these things. You know, when you're out on these bushwalks and directed for a particular purpose, you say to yourself, oh God, am I going to achieve this? Is it still going to be there? Can I make it? And then it is quite elating to be out in the bush by yourself at the pool of Siloam, able to consider the whole scene in front of me. And yeah, it was very elating.
Now we come to the giants of Tasmania, the giant eucalypts. These are trees that are more like skyscrapers than pencils. They're just awesome to look at, and something slightly terrifying about them too, in their gigantic woody immensity right in the southwest of Tasmania. Now, you went out to see a giant eucalypt that was called the Vibe Tower. What brought you to the Vibe Tower?
So, forest activism takes all kinds of forms in Tasmania. And the form that this young couple took, Steve Pearce and Jen Sanger, Steve, a rope climber par excellence, Jen, an ecologist, the form that their activism took was to get people up giant eucalypts. There was a particular grove that Steve had found that they called the Grove of Giants that had several species of giant eucalypt in it, including probably the largest known blue gum in the world, largest at about more than 300 cubic metres. That is more than 300 tonnes of tree held in the air by nature. And the Vibe tree, the vibe was just right to take people up this one. They had open days and people would come and get hauled up the tree.
And one of them was you on one particular day. Can you describe the experience of being hauled up a tree, what you saw as you were being hauled up by pulleys up into this giant?
My nephew, who came with me, described it appropriately as buttock clenching. You begin in full confidence of the ascent. You know Steve's got the ropes right. You know that Jen's up the top to meet you. You've got 60 metres of tree to be hauled up. And so you harness up, you sit there, he tells you what to do, what not to do, and suddenly your feet are in the air, and then they're further in the air, and further in the air, and much further in the air. So inevitably my heart was racing. I was clinging way too tight to the rope, but I ascended, met Jen up the top, and she was very chirpy, and we sat there and there were swift parrots zitting around a flowering gum below us. And the view was of other giant eucalypts around me. I don't actually really recall too much more of that, should I? So because they do it on a pulley system, one person up, one person down, it was my time to go down, and so I embraced the sweet earth. Very glad that we had left the trees a million years ago or whenever. But for people like them, it's just a playground. There was a wonderful group of women climbers who, when I say playground, it was absolutely their playground. They were whooping to each other from tree to tree sort of thing. At one point, one of them described to me that they'd been in a bit of wind and they were being blown about like tea bags dangling, you know. But she was perfectly happy with all of that. She loved being in that environment. Their work was part of the effort to actually measure the carbon that was held by this old-growth forest area. And there is a lot of carbon held in old-growth forest and a lot lost when it's logged.
So this was set to be logged. What happened to that? What got in the way of that?
Well, I think Jen and Steve got in the way, and they particularly got in the way, they say, by taking people up the tree, up the Vibe tree, and by showing them the value of the forest, by getting them to write to politicians. But there was a single other reason why that happened.
And what was that single other reason?
Out of the blue, Jen was contacted by the US Embassy in Canberra. They'd seen one of her scientific works on forest carbon, and their ambassador was going to be going to Tasmania, so they thought this might be an interesting thing to talk to her about forest carbon. And then Jen mentioned taking people up the trees. And when the ambassador came down, the ambassador Caroline Kennedy,
Daughter of JFK.
said, I'd like to go up. So Caroline Kennedy went up the vibe tree.
What did her security detail think about that?
Well, they were a bit reluctant at first, but after the ambassador had gone up, her bodyguard said, well, I better go up too. Here, hold my gun. So he went up too. To me, that was game over. If you've got Caroline Kennedy going up the vibe tree in the Grove of Giants, that ain't going to be logged.
Might be the last time a US government official gets a good environmental outcome in the world. So the Grove is no longer slated to be logged.
No, it's off the list.
It's off the list. And finally, you've concluded with the Fagus, a kind of plant that's called Fagus. What is Fagus? Can you describe that to me?
Fagus is a deciduous beech. It is Australia's only endemic winter deciduous tree. There are other trees in Tasmania like the cedar, which are deciduous, but they're not endemic. They're also found in Asia.
And deciduous meaning it sheds its leaves.
Sheds its leaves. It does that thing that deciduous trees do, which is turn colour. Fagus turns yellows and golds and reds. It adorns these wild landscapes, particularly through the end of April into early May. It's a low-growing plant, and so it does things like define the landscape around it differently.
What do you mean?
So somewhere like Crater Lake, which is just next to Cradle Mountain, has really wonderful Fagus that I was looking at. And so there you'll see the runnels down the rock faces defined by Fagus, or a sheet of good ground is covered in Fagus, and it sort of paints the rock and paints the landscape. I went to a place called Tyndall Plateau, and Tyndall Plateau faces the Southern Ocean winds. It's a very wild place. And you would see things like boulder, glacial erratic boulder sitting on the plateau, and behind it would be an exact twin in golden Fagus. The boulder was there and the Fagus twin was hunched against the wind behind the boulder.
So many of these ancient trees are kind of living under the witness protection program in an undisclosed location in Tasmania. Why is their location often kept secret?
It's a question of protecting the vulnerable. Different approaches are taken, not just in Tasmania, to protecting trees. Wollemi pine is somewhere in the Wollemi National Park. The bristlecone pine, the single oldest trunk of a tree in the world, 4,000 odd years old, is somewhere in a bristlecone national park. It's not identified because fear of people taking a souvenir of it.
Yeah, or just some idiot vandalising it.
Some idiot
for
vandalising
selfie,
it.
Yeah.
And potentially some of these trees in Tasmania face that same sort of problem. The balance has to be, though, in understanding their particular significance, the particular lessons they have to offer us. The lesson of the Huon pine in longevity, the lesson of the King Billy in Jurassic longevity, the lesson of King's Lomatia in terms of its single scientific discovery, the science of it that has led to us understanding how important it is.
It might be said that before you went on this 3-year solo hike through Tasmania to find these trees, you were a man who couldn't see the trees for the forest. You were going and zipping in and out.
That's exactly right.
Reporting on the forest, getting out. Now this time you went in to actually look at the trees themselves. Does it change you, this experience? Or was that too much to say?
Oh, no, I think it is. I think it has changed me. It's given me a huge engagement now with my surroundings. I understand, I can look at a landscape now and I can say, well, fire's been through there. It hasn't been here. Roughly when the fire went through, things like that. And I can appreciate those sorts of stories of the landscape much, much better now that I've been out among them.
Does it make you feel more embedded in the land where you live?
Absolutely does. There's no question. I'm a spruiker for the beauties of these trees, yeah.
What a pleasure it is to speak with you. Thank you for telling your story today, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Richard.
Andrew's book is called The Ancients, Discovering the World's Oldest Surviving Trees in Wild Tasmania.
This is Conversations with Richard Fiedler. You can find more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
Today's conversation was made on the lands of the Gadigal people. Producer was Alice Moldovan, executive producer was Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fiedler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fiedler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Hello there, I'm Mark Fennell, and you may know me as the guy who finds the stuff that the British stole. Still doing that, but I'm also embarking now on a new hunt. This is a hunt for the people, the objects, the actions, the stuff-ups, the moments that essentially changed the course of history, but at the time, no one saw them coming. Each week, we will unravel stories from across the globe, from bizarre crimes you might never have heard of.
He's using the early 20th century equivalent of a high-vis vest and a lanyard to get into the Louvre undetected.
To brushes with death that changed science.
He sort of becomes like a boogeyman or a demon. Something you read, it sort of sends a chill down your spine.
You'll meet the people whose presence continues to be felt from the grave.
He imagined a secret society which would be watching the schools, the universities, to establish a worldwide English-speaking global elite.
There is no chapter of history that is off limits, and each and every one of these inflection points has somehow reshaped your life and my life.
I don't think this is talked about enough.
The outcome of World War II was not a foregone conclusion.
We think that restitution is a contemporary debate. It's really not. It's been going on forever.
No one saw it coming. Brand new episodes every Tuesday. You can listen on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Had Freud been alive at the time, he would have had a field day with all of this.